Now, last week, Chinese car maker Geely was very proud of the fact that it had brought a bunch of Geely E5 electric SUVs from China all the way to Malaysia, a distance in excess of 3,700 kilometers. And as part of those celebrations, today they've invited the press out here to the Proton test track in Shah Alam to sample these cars on the track for us to understand what these cars are like out on the road and also to understand what we're working with as it moves into the Proton EMAS 7. However, in addition to a test drive preview out here on the track, we have also been given exclusive access to drive these cars out on the road to see what they're like in the wild. So, without further ado, my name is AIMAN ABDULLAH, this is Malaysian Motoring, and this is our media preview of the Geely E5 in Malaysia. Now, the Geely E5 is a C-segment SUV, which means that it will go head-to-head with vehicles like the BYD Atto 3, as well as the GAC Ion Y Plus and the Chery Omoda E5, which means that these cars will be arriving in sort of the meat and potatoes as it shows up as the Proton EMAS 7. Now, it is worth noting that, again, these cars that we're driving here are the Chinese domestic market vehicles, which means that specifications on these are not reflective of the cars that we'll get here. Neither are they reflective of the Geely EX5, which is the export market version of these cars. Now, for the most part, what we can see from here, what we can glean from this preview is the design. At the front end, it is very subtle, it is very pared back in order to give this car what they describe as an inoffensive look that is suitable for many international markets. Now, this particular vehicle rides on Goodyear tires wrapped around 19-inch alloy wheels. Now, we can't speak of the Proton EMAS 7 because specifications like those are still waiting to be finalized, and so we can't speak too much about that. But overall, I do think that the side profile of this car does look pretty good. Now, again, this is ultimately going to be a family car, so it's not meant to look overly bold because, again, you would then risk alienating certain buyers, and I do think that Geely has done a pretty good job at making sure that the E5 should appeal to a relatively broad market. Now, one of the design features that the Proton EMAS 7 will share with the Geely E5 later is this full-width light bar, which is broken up in the middle here by these sort of vertical lines, which I think does look very distinctive, and it does mean that when these cars eventually arrive, you won't mistake them for anything else. I apologize for the wind noise, in case there is any, because it is suddenly surprisingly windy. Now, again, this back end is relatively neat because, again, this is meant to be a car to appeal to a broad audience, which means that design that is overly extroverted, for example, might end up alienating buyers. Now, behind the tailgate, you will find a pretty good amount of space. There is no tonneau cover, which is worth noting, but there is also a bass subwoofer back here for the audio system, which we'll touch on when we get inside the car. Now, because this is ultimately going to be a family SUV, practicality naturally is very important, which means that having a good amount of space up here is critical. But in addition to the fact that you have this dual level floor, which means you can actually lower the boot floor in order to increase your vertical load capacity. It also means that underneath the boot floor, you have something what they're referring to as a bathtub. Now, what this essentially is a huge amount of space in order for you to keep more items should you want to. It's lined in plastic, which means that if you have dirty shoes, for example, or wet umbrellas, they can go down here. And more importantly, this also serves as a space for the charging cables because there is no space underneath the bonnet. Now, if you ask me, this does seem like a pretty practical space. It's just that the lack of a tonneau cover does mean that if you do have valuables back here, they are going to be very visible. Now, one of the things that I can speak quite confidently about, however, is this interior, because between the Geely E5 and the EMAS 7, we will see a lot of these things carried over. And so this interior does seem relatively upmarket with a design that, again, is designed not to offend anyone. And as a result, this minimalist cabin does look relatively upmarket, looks relatively premium, and there are certain features in here that I know will stand out compared to other competitors within the space. So, as expected with a new generation EV, we do have a massive screen here, which does a lot of things, I suppose, because it's all in Mandarin. Now, I'm told that this Fly Me Auto system will be adapted for the local market and should integrate certain features that we first saw from Smart. Things like the live charging map, for example, should be a feature within this. Now, I'm told this car does come with a voice assistant that is quite adept. The problem... However, I don't speak Mandarin, and so there's no way of testing that. However, in terms of the response times and so on, this is a system that is based off of a pretty recent graphics card and chip set and so on, which means that this should be relatively responsive. We do get dual zone climate control, there's automatic air conditioning, there is also heating and ventilation in these seats, although we expect only ventilation to be available on the PROTON EMAS 7 when that arrives. In terms of the driving position, these seats are very comfortable. There is a decent amount of adjustment within them, although there is no angle or tilt adjustment, only height. I've got a heads-up display, I've got a digital instrument cluster up ahead here, which gives me all the relevant information that I need at a glance, which is excellent compared to what we've seen from, say, Tesla. And so overall, life in here does seem pretty good. Practicality is pretty well catered for. We've got a couple of cup holders here, wireless charging pad, a pretty decently sized center console bin, which is also air conditioned, although there is no vent, it just seems to be very cold. And there's also space underneath here for a USB-C port and a 12-volt outlet. I apologize for that noise because there's an ambulance nearby with its engine running. Now, hooked up to this center screen, you will find the Fly Me Sound audio system. Now, this is a 1000 watt system with speakers everywhere, not just up here on the dash, but there are also speakers built into the driver's headrest in order to give you a sense of immersion when it comes to your music. And I certainly look forward to testing that out in the future. Although in this particular vehicle, at the moment, it doesn't come with Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, but I've been assured that when the PROTON EMAS 7 arrives, it should come with Apple CarPlay and Android Auto as standard, although it is not clear if it will be wired or wireless. The other thing that's not quite clear is actually this upholstery. So in the Galaxy E5 that we're in now, as you can see, we have this beautiful black and white two-tone upholstery where it's black on the top and white on the bottom. These seats are also done up in this beautiful white perforated leather in order to allow for the ventilation. And overall, life does seem quite comfortable in here, although it is not clear whether or not the EMAS 7 will arrive with this lighter colored interior, although it would certainly be nice. Now, one of the features that Geely is pointing out to us quite fervently is actually this knob. Now, this knob does a variety of different things. At the moment, it's currently doing the volume, but you can press it, you can toggle it, you can swivel it, and this apparently controls a myriad of functions based on the context that you're in. It can control drive modes, it can control your air conditioning, it can control lots of different things depending on where you are. So for example, now that I'm in the air conditioning controls, by turning this, I actually adjust the temperature. Now, again, there isn't really that much for me to test here because all of this is in Mandarin, but I'm going to assume that this works. And overall, everything in here does seem quite promising so far. But one thing that I can confirm is that because the EMAS 7 will be based on this car, it does mean the wheelbase and interior space should be very similar. And so with the front seat set in my driving position, about 170 centimeters, as you can see, I have a good amount of knee room and a pretty good amount of headroom despite the standard fit panoramic sunroof. The floor here is completely flat. There are air conditioning vents in the middle, which means that life back here is surprisingly comfortable. And one thing that I will note is that a lot of SUVs like this usually have a floor that is too high, and so you don't get a lot of under-thigh support. But here, because I have a good amount of legroom and there is also space for me to tuck my feet in underneath the seat in front of me, I can enjoy a pretty good amount of legroom. Now, the Chinese delegation that drove this car here say that over the several days that it took for them to get here, the 3,700 kilometers that I mentioned earlier, life back here was largely very pleasant, thanks again to the air conditioning, the USB-A and USB-C ports, and of course, all the practical bits in here like the spaces in the doors as well as this armrest with a couple of cup holders. And so life back here was quite comfortable throughout the duration of their journey. But for families, you may be a bit more concerned with other things. So for example, as you can see, because we've got a good amount of space, a bulky rear-facing child seat should not be too much of an issue. These doors open nice and wide. The quality here is all just as good as you'd expect. And of course, there are ISOFIX mounts for you to mount child seats should you want it. The only thing that I will note, however, is that these cars don't appear to come with any sort of privacy tinting on the windows, which means that you might need to invest in tint if you have younger children. However, it is worth pointing out the fact that while the packaging in this car does seem to be pretty positive, especially with things like this tray down here, I apologize for the slightly weird angle, but with a tray down here, with space in the doors and so on, this is largely what you would expect from a family SUV, electric or otherwise. The bigger question is how these cars are like to drive. Now, we are going to take these cars out on the track and then later we're going to take them out on the road. But I would like to point out the fact that these are the Chinese domestic market vehicles. The PROTON EMAS 7 will be given a little bit more engineering tuning before they finally arrive on the market, which is why they haven't been launched just yet. And so this should give us an indication of some things, but not everything. So now that I've managed your expectations, let's take this out on the track first. So now we're driving the Geely E5 out on track. Now, firstly, as you can tell by this angle, this is obviously a left-hand drive vehicle, and so naturally the orientation is a little bit different. But it is worth pointing out that this is ultimately a China-assembled vehicle. This is one of the cars that were driven over 3,700 kilometers from China all the way here to Malaysia. Now we've been given a very short experience drive out here on the Proton test track, where we'll be allowed to go up to speeds of 110 kilometers an hour. And what we were told emphatically is that this is ultimately a Chinese market model, which means the suspension is a little bit softer. That means that there are certain specifications on this car that may or may not make it to the Malaysian model, and whatever specifications that do arrive on the Proton EMAS 7 will have been localized in order to fit local requirements. Now from the off, the first thing that strikes me is this car's refinement. While doing about 110, 103 kilometers an hour indicated, I do note that there isn't much in terms of road noise or wind noise, but then again, we have been on this track many times before, and so we know that the surface here is especially smooth, and so road noise tends to be minimized anyway. Wind noise, I will note, is a little bit more prevalent at speeds in excess of 120 kilometers an hour, but so far things do seem to be quite stable. Now I can't speak much to ride and handling today because again, this is an oval track and there aren't that many imperfections on the track itself, but it does seem that body control is pretty well managed, but again, this is after all a banked track. Now as we exit this corner, I'm going to punch it, much to the annoyance of the safety advisor to my right. And we're going to see just how refined this car can get at 140 kilometers an hour. There is a little bit of wind whistle around the wing mirrors. I have to bring this back down to about 110 now in order to get through the bank track. And even at these speeds, I can say the refinement is still pretty good. Now, the Proton EMAS 7 is expected to arrive with a battery just under 70 kilowatt hours, which means that we should have a WLTP range of about 430 kilometers. In terms of overall performance, the EMAS 7 does apparently outdo the BYD Atto 3, let alone vehicles at the GAC Ion Y+, etc., which means that this should be very well specified for our market. Now, of course, there is also now the added confusion of the Leapmotor C10, which is one size category larger, but is expected to compete at broadly the same price, and so we expect this to come in at about 140,000 ringgit. But I can say that from the impressions that we're getting of the Geely E5, it is quite clear that when the EMAS 7 arrives with the additional tuning and additional ride and handling R&D, development, etc., we should expect these cars to perform quite impressively. So as far as I can tell from here, the seats are very comfortable. I've got ventilation cooling my ass, and I can't speak much of the user interface because this Fly Me Auto system, which was developed in conjunction with Meizu, which is also owned by Geely, it does seem to respond quite well, but of course naturally everything is in Chinese, which means I have very little ability to interact with this, and so I just have to pray that everything is working the way it's supposed to. But overall, everything does seem to be responsive enough. Now, one of the things I do want to test out on this car eventually when it is translated to English is the connectivity with mobile devices like my mobile phone, as well as the Fly Me sound system. Because again, Geely is making a lot of noise about how this is apparently a very good audio system, but that remains to be seen. And more importantly, it also remains to be seen if this is an upgrade over the X70. But overall, so far this car does seem quite impressive. However, we've been given an exclusive opportunity to drive these cars out of the test track. So given that that is a little bit more relevant, perhaps, to the buying public, what matters more is what these cars are like out on the open road, and on the open road is exactly where we are. Now, you join me again on the wrong side of the car because the Galaxy E5 naturally was driven from China, and so being Chinese domestic models, they are left-hand drive. So first off the bat, I'd like to point out that this is one of the strangest sensations I've ever had, because I am used to driving cars from the left, but I'm normally in a country where everybody drives on the right. And so driving a left-hand drive car in a right-hand drive country is a very strange sensation, but here we are. Now, of course, the reason why we're being brought out today is in order to experience what is ultimately going to serve as the developmental basis for the Proton EMAS 7. Now, in terms of the mechanical bits and pieces, we're told that the EMAS 7 should offer a 60 plus kilowatt hour battery under 70, which means that it should have a WLTP range of about 430 kilometers, and this car should largely be in line with the Galaxy EX5, which is notably the export market specification. But the cars that we have here are again the Chinese domestic market models, and so these cars should have broadly the same performance, etc., and you should have have all of the statistics up on screen now. Now, the reason why ProNet has brought us out today is to experience what these cars are like out on the open road, on different surfaces, driving through different driving scenarios and so on. But of course, because this car is designed and engineered in Mandarin, it also means that there are a lot of features that I cannot test. So for example, any questions about the adaptive cruise control, intelligent cruise control, etc., you will have to refrain because I can't answer any of those questions at the moment. But what I can say is that being a Chinese car, it drives like a Chinese vehicle. Now what that means is the suspension of this car is unreasonably soft. So the primary ride in this car is great because it deals with lumps and bumps pretty well, but the secondary ride does mean that it takes a long time for this car to settle down. As a result, it means that when you're driving, especially at slightly higher speeds, it doesn't quite give you the same degree of confidence that you might expect from a vehicle within this size class. But that aside, everything else in here does seem quite positive. The driving position, for example, although clearly on the wrong side of the vehicle, is still very comfortable. I get a very good view out. The dashboard is laid down nice and low, which means that again my visibility all the way around is quite good. And even though again I'm looking at the mirrors from the wrong side of the car, I still have a pretty good view out the left side wing mirror, right side wing mirror, in order to figure out where it is I'm going and trying not to kill motorcyclists. Now, the other thing that has already struck me, because I'm not the first person to drive this, I had an experience sitting in this car in the rear as we drove up and down the motorway, is that this car is amazingly refined. Now, Geely apparently has a reputation in China for making vehicles that are known to be very, very quiet, and so this car is certainly no different in that regard. And so, as we pull over so that we can find the rest of the convoy, this now provides me a little bit more headspace to talk. So one of the things that I appreciate about the Geely Galaxy E5 so far is that again the driving position is pretty good. I have a good amount of adjustment from the steering wheel. I have a heads-up display which is not only right in my line of sight, but it's also full color, and it also shows you what the car can see, which means that your usual ADAS functionalities that we first saw from, say, the Smart #1, instead of being in the instrument cluster, is actually in your heads-up display. Same goes for your indicators and so on, which means that you are less reliant on the instrument cluster itself. Now, the central screen probably does a million different things, but again, I don't understand Mandarin, and so there's very little that I can do with this, but so far the air conditioning works great. But I think that from this short preview drive, it is quite clear that this is a very, very well engineered vehicle. Now, bearing in mind that the very car that I'm driving right now has already traversed 3,700 kilometers from China all the way to Malaysia, and these cars are still as well built and screwed together as you would expect from a car straight off of the production line. And that certainly bodes well in terms of what we can expect from the PROTON EMAS 7 when that launches out in December. But aside from that, there are still lots of other things that we have yet to discover and we are not yet able to test because this car is in Mandarin. And so when we finally get these cars in a proper language, then we'll be able to test out some of these functionalities. But so far, so good. It does seem quite promising indeed. Now, before the convoy sets off again, I'm going to try and wrap this up. So as far as I'm concerned, the Galaxy E5 is a pretty well-engineered, well-specified vehicle, and that again bodes well for the PROTON EMAS 7. This drive has allowed us to get a better understanding of what these cars are like within the context of the real world, and again, everything seems promising so far. But we certainly hope that you will stay tuned as we bring you more updates about the PROTON EMAS 7 as time goes by. But that concludes our coverage of the Galaxy E5 in Malaysia, in left-hand drive, on a test track and out on the open road. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon so notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the description below, including the link to join our new WhatsApp channel. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Take care and stay safe.